My name is Robert Butler, and I'm the Joan and Lester Brune Chair of History at Elmhurst University. And I'm here to talk about some of the people, faculty, staff, and students who Elmhurst made, and who made Elmhurst in their turn. Some of them are famous. One had his face on the cover of Time magazine and influenced the actions of an American president, while others are almost anonymous, but they're no less important for all that. They vary widely in time and space from the beginning to the end of the century. What have they got in common? I think a few things. First, all were influenced by the school. Second, all deserve the grateful thanks of Elmhurst. We're proud of what they did. And all deserve to be remembered and celebrated for what they achieved. So I want to take some time today and tell you about them and about what they did at Elmhurst and later on in the world. I'm going to focus on 4 moments from the school's history and the people who seized a chance to make a difference. First, the heavy work required to change Elmhurst from a preparatory secondary school into a full 4-year modern college. Second, the effort students made to provide a refuge to some people in desperate need of one. Third, the hard work behind the scenes required to keep the campus running for those who teach and study here. And finally, some brief examples of recent grads and some thought about what makes Elmhurst special. I'm going to start with 2 brothers, both of whom originally hoped to become ministers and teachers, but who were changed by Elmhurst and then helped change the school they knew into a modern American college. Elmhurst was founded in 1871 as a secondary school, a proseminary for the German Evangelical Synod of North America. As you can tell from this photo, taken in 1900, most of its students were as young as 14 or 15 or 16, and they were intending to make their careers as pastors in evangelical congregations or teachers in evangelical schools. Elmhurst was meant to prepare them for further study at Eden Seminary in St. Louis, thus leading to the once popular phrase, Elmhurst, Eden, and eternity. The Elmhurst curriculum resembled that of a traditional German gymnasium or prep school. There were very few electives. Students studied the classics, history, math and music, some basic science, and all subjects were taught in German. Even English was taught in German. The education was broad but shallow. A report in 1898 noted that in geography, Asia, Africa, and Australia were only covered in brief. Learning was by rote and not very exciting. Students occasionally fell asleep in class, as sometimes they still do today. But apparently back then, even some professors dozed during student recitations. And I'm willing to bet it's been a long time since that happened here. This kind of education may have satisfied the original need for ministers and teachers, but by the turn of the 20th century, it was coming to seem old-fashioned and outdated. Students detested the rigidity of the curriculum. Graduates had difficulty enrolling in American colleges and universities. And some in the Evangelical Synod were distressed by the fact that there were so few opportunities for any kind of an advanced education. One way to meet all these challenges at once was to convert the pro-seminary into a college on the American model. 2 significant figures in that long struggle were brothers, Reinhold and H. Richard Niebuhr. The Niebuhrs came from a family of German immigrants. Their father was a pastor, first in Missouri, later on in Illinois. Reinhold, the eldest, graduated from Elmhurst in 1910, and he went on to Eden Seminary. His brother Richard followed him 2 years later. Both later went on to careers of national significance. Reinhold became the most influential American theologian of the 20th century, a thinker, whose works influenced Martin Luther King and Barack Obama. Richard was one of the most important scholars of theology and ethics in the modern Protestant tradition. Both were unstoppable forces in the transformation of the proseminary, one from the outside and the other from within. Both hold a special place here at Elmhurst. Graduating in 1910, Reinhold had gone on to Eden Seminary, very dissatisfied with the rather basic education he had received at Elmhurst. He joined with several other students at Eden to push for higher educational standards for all the Synod's schools, and particularly for Elmhurst. 2 years later, Richard came to Eden and kept up the campaign. But it was an uphill struggle. Some were happy with things as they were, and any change would require considerably more resources than the Synod had ready. Just the construction of a new library for Elmhurst in 1921 had required a huge effort. Reinhold Niebuhr had led the campaign with a letter asking for donations. The memorial library opened the following year, but a college would require even more. As a compromise, Elmhurst opened a junior college in 1919 to operate alongside the existing school. But as compromises often do, this solution satisfied no one. The Synod decided in 1921 that it was time for Elmhurst to become a full 4-year college. The man who brought Elmhurst into its new existence was its new president, H. Richard Niebuhr. 1924, at the age of only 30, the recent graduate of the proseminary had the chance to change the course of Elmhurst and create a college that would provide a broad liberal arts education for its students. As his famous phrase insisted, the most urgent need of the present generation of men is light and warmth, the light of knowledge and the warmth of high idealism. But realizing this ideal was going to take a huge effort and no little amount of money. Niebuhr threw himself into the task at once. By the following year, Niebuhr had drawn up a gigantic plan of expansion. Over the next 4 years, it was planned to create a fund 10 times as large as the college's current endowment. Elmhurst would build a gymnasium and a dormitory, expand departments, laboratories, and the library, and win national accreditation. Over 10 years, the college expected to further expand its campus as well as its programs. Architect Benjamin Franklin Olson projected a plan for numerous buildings around a central mall, which, as you alumni will recognize, provided the blueprint for the shape Elmhurst's campus has held ever since. Interestingly enough, if you look at the top of this picture, which would be the far western edge of the campus, you can see a little quadrangle named for the women. So women as students at Elmhurst was being planned long before it happened. President Niebuhr was envisioning a school that would be the equal of any university in the nation. All this, of course, was going to cost staggering amounts of money. None of it had yet been raised. The Synod's assistance was limited. Nevertheless, Niebuhr pushed ahead, spending money on the development of courses, expanding the faculty to teach them, and recruiting students to take them. The college began to plan seriously for admitting women for the first time. Niebuhr traveled constantly, speaking to groups everywhere in the nation in the effort to raise money for his vision. But the money drained faster than it could be replaced. At one point, Niebuhr was told that there was only 21 cents in the ready account. The college had to raise tuition and beg loans to pay salaries and utilities. All of this huge effort was directed and energized, and often personally led, by H. Richard Niebuhr. The effort took its toll. Within 2 years, Richard Niebuhr was on the verge of a breakdown. Despite occasional respites, he concluded that it was time for him to retire from the presidency and return to the scholarly life he had temporarily put aside. He left office in the summer of 1927 and took up a faculty position at Eden, later at Yale. His brother Reinhold was asked if he would consider becoming president, but he declined. The example of both the Niebers' efforts was never forgotten at Elmhurst. The library that Reinhold had helped create served the school until the 1960s. As for Richard, he dragged a small, provincial, often unwilling religious school into the 20th century and turned it into a college. Both are remembered today in such Elmhurst institutions as the Niebuhr Lecture, the Niebuhr Center, and the Niebuhr Medal, given, as it says, for extraordinary service to humanity, fitting tribute to the careers of two of our most celebrated graduates. No doubt, one lesson of these years was that dreams have costs. But the other side of that lesson was that dreams are important. Elmhurst would have been considerably different, no doubt considerably smaller, without their vision and determination. Well, the college grew slowly over the next few years. Times of revolutionary change often require a period of quiet adjustment after. By 1929, the Great Depression hit. Many fund pledges were suddenly reduced or vanished altogether. Above all, Elmhurst's endowment stayed small, vastly overshadowed by a crushing debt, money borrowed to create the college. So there were few resources for any more physical or academic improvements. Nevertheless, things slowly improved. Women were finally admitted to Elmhurst in the fall of 1930. By the end of that decade, almost half the student population were women. The college as a whole continued to grow, though slowly. By the end of the 30s, there were more than 350 students at Elmhurst. At a time of economic distress, that was a pretty good record. And it was a sign that Niebuhr and the reformers had been right about the appeal of the liberal arts colleges. And the college, faculty and staff alike, were taking a broader interest in the world. This was important because before long, world affairs were going to be influencing Elmhurst College. The economic depression and the social unrest in America were mirrored abroad, but with a greater impact. By the early 1930s, the world was descending into a very dark era. Democracy and open societies were vanishing. Dictatorships and racism were on the rise. In such conditions, anyone outside the mainstream was in increasing danger. At Elmhurst, with its traditional ties to Europe and especially to Germany, this terrible situation was clear to everyone. As things grew worse, the college, and especially its students, were convinced that it was time to do something. They couldn't simply stand idly by and watch. They had a growing desire to do two things. First, to help individuals caught up in the disaster by bringing college students who were refugees to the United States and to Elmhurst. And second, bring a little bit more diversity to the campus itself. The college had already made some small moves in this direction. They had recently begun recruiting students from Hungarian immigrant families. Many came to Elmhurst. We had, for a while, a Department of Hungarian Studies. But by the time the war broke out, the vision had expanded. The Student Refugee Committee, a student-run committee, began collecting money to bring European college student refugees over. The first to arrive were a German and a Czech. And later on, they hoped to offer places to Chinese students escaping the Japanese War of Conquest in Asia. The Student Refugee Committee collected funds constantly. There were bake sales, there were pledge cards. Most of the amounts were small, 75 cents, $1, but nearly the entire student body contributed. It was a good idea, but the going was difficult. Traveling abroad was much different then than it is now. No airlines crossed the ocean, just passenger ships, fewer, slower, more expensive routes to America. And immigration to the United States was complicated by the quota system that kept many people out. And the World War, which had started in 1939, complicated things even more. Although the US was still at peace, travel was considerably riskier. Everything changed in December of 1941. Elmhurst had managed to bring over a few European refugee students. But Pearl Harbor and America's entry into the war meant that now our borders were closed. Foreigners simply couldn't get in. But here in the US, a large group of Americans had become refugees in their own country. In the spring of 1942, Japanese Americans on the West Coast were rounded up from their homes, taken away to internment camps. All were legal residents. Almost all were American citizens, but none of that mattered in 1942. Feelings were high, and racism was never far beneath the surface. But so too was the desire to rise above the racism, and to do the right thing, to live up to America's promises. So the Student Refugee Committee shifted its focus. Instead of Chinese students, they would bring Japanese American students to Elmhurst. This was one of Elmhurst College's better moments. Throughout the war, the committee brought several Nisei students to campus. At first, there was opposition from the local VFW and American Legion. Some public protests about allowing students from the Japanese race to study at an American college. I have to point out, this was a pretty popular attitude at that time. Many larger and more famous schools, such as Wisconsin and Northwestern, announced that they would not let Japanese students in. But as an editorial in the Elm Bark, the college student newspaper said, "Here's a fight that must be won by students." The editorial looked ahead to a day when others, like Black Americans or impoverished and unprepared of any race, would be present on campus as well. And once Japanese American students began to arrive, they were welcomed by the faculty, the staff, and the students. One of them later recalled that while things were a little tense in the town, he had no problems on campus. It may have been a small effort. Refugee student numbers were never large, but it was more than many schools were doing. And it made all the difference in the world to the students who came. Well, in the post-war years, the college boomed. Changes began coming fast and furious. Thanks to the GI Bill, veterans enrolled in colleges and universities all across the land, and Elmhurst was no exception. Enrollment at Elmhurst almost doubled. By 1947, nearly 40% of Elmhurst students were veterans. The composition of the student body had begun to change as well. The first Black students enrolled just after the war. Foreign students were less of a rarity on campus. The Student Refugee Committee continued to raise support for one scholarship student each year, but others enrolled and came to Elmhurst on their own. An evening session was begun in 1949 for people who worked during the day. More students, more classes, more faculty. Soon, there were more buildings as well. The first to arrive was a new dorm. President Henry Dinkmeyer, it's an interesting story, dug a hole in the ground where Lehman Hall now is, and he posted a sign as a challenge to the world, a hole to be filled by faith. And soon it was. Lehman Hall opened in 1951. The hole to be filled by faith was such a successful gambit that it was used for another dorm, now Dinkmeyer Hall, and the chapel. Later on, the faculty apartments, a heating plant, the college union, now the Frick Center, and the library followed rapidly. In addition to the buildings, the college grounds were developed. It won't surprise any alum of Elmhurst to hear that parking was a huge problem, even back in the 1950s. As you can tell from this picture, students parked cars everywhere they could, including around the mall. At one point, a Volkswagen Beetle ended up in the chapel, but honesty compels me to add that this was a prank and not a regular parking spot. Clearly, some attention had to be paid to the college's physical environment. Enter the man who did more than anyone else to make the college look the way it does today, Ragnar Moen. Ragnar was born in Norway. He made a living as a merchant sailor for several years before emigrating to the United States in 1961. Elmhurst hired him as a groundsman in 1966, just as the college was applying for official status as an arboretum with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Now, at the time they made the application, there were only 15 species of plants here. So perhaps it was a gesture of optimism on the college's part. But Ragnar took it as a challenge, and he took it seriously. Within 2 decades, there were more than 700 species on campus. By the time he retired, the number was nearing 1,000. Above all, Ragnar loved trees: beech, maple, oak, crabapple, yew, and elm. Planted them everywhere. Students from grade schools all around began to visit the Arboretum on field trips. In addition to trees and flowers, Ragnar and his staff kept the sidewalks clear of leaves in the fall and snow in the winter, maintained the baseball diamond, now gone, and the football field, now artificial turf, and all college buildings, old and new, as the college expanded. They worked wonders. Elmhurst was a small jewel. And here's why that's important. I vividly remember, as a recently hired brand new faculty member, wondering what our competition in the western suburbs looked like. So one Saturday in fall, I jumped in my car and visited several little colleges and universities around, no names, just to see what they looked like and how we compared. I was stunned. Our competition looked like it was falling apart. Weeds instead of flowers, broken, cracked sidewalks, dusty brick buildings with mortar missing in large chunks. I came home that day with a new appreciation for the staff that kept our school looking so beautiful. People always notice how lovely the campus is. That doesn't happen that way by itself. Be sure and thank the staff the next time you see them for all their hard and too often unsung work. In recent years, Elmhurst has continued to attract more and more talent. Just a look at some of the people that have graduated. Audrey Wagner, class of 1950, an athlete at a time when Elmhurst did not have any women's athletic programs. Audrey had joined the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League at the age of 15. Think of the movie, A League of Their Own. She stayed in the league after enrolling as a pre-med student here. By the time she graduated, she was the Player of the Year. Roland Quest, who had attended in the 30s, went on to a successful engineering career and helped design the space shuttle. It's his bequest that brings so many excellent speakers to the campus still. Many famous figures in journalism and broadcasting got their start at Elmhurst, including Terry Hemmert, longtime radio personality and public affairs director at her station WXRT, and incidentally, the commencement speaker in 2017. Sue Ellen Rocca, a soft-spoken woman with a national reputation as an artist, who became the curator of the college's remarkable art collection. Today, the college continues to evolve. Another Elmhurst president, Robert Stanger, once said, "Times change, and we have to change along with them." And we have. Today at Elmhurst, the total student count is about 3,400 and some odd, depending on which semester you're looking. Students from 32 countries are here at Elmhurst. 40% of them are students of color. 42% are first-generation college students. Nearly 2/3 of the students are female. 3/4 are commuters. And of course, we're now Elmhurst University, no longer Elmhurst College. President Stanger also wrote, "A college with a heritage such as Elmhurst has ought to try somehow to maintain its uniqueness." Well, I think we have. So what is our uniqueness? Believe it or not, I've spent a good deal of my career here wondering about that. And here's my conclusion, which I'm going to pose as a question. Is there a core of Elmhurstness somewhere? A tiny, stretchy little nugget that remains from our pro-seminar days 150 years ago that will inform our future as a university? I say yes, and it's this. Elmhurst faculty, staff, and students all have one thing in common: the desire to make this world a slightly better place, and a willingness to put in the hard work to make that happen. It's a pretty idealistic enterprise. It's not always easy. It's not always fun. It's never finished. But it's absolutely necessary. Frankly, I think it's needed now as much as ever. Richard Niebuhr was right. The present generation of students, whenever you're looking at them, need the light of knowledge and the warmth of high idealism. And that, I think, is the core of Elmhurst. As I finish, I want to thank everyone who helped me put this lecture together. Just about everybody I know has contributed in one way or another. But I need to single out especially the wonderful staff of the Elmhurst History Museum. Melinda Cutright's History, an Ever-Widening Circle. Elaine Page and the archive staff at Elmhurst. And a great many student papers I've read over the years, especially Christopher Hewitt's. Thank you all. You're a marvelous example of the Elmhurst spirit.